On a cold November night, downtown Chicago erupted in sudden violence. Two nearly simultaneous shootings among groups of teenagers left 8 wounded and a 14-year-old dead. Within hours, Donald Trump revived his call for a sweeping federal crackdown on the city, arguing Chicago's leaders had failed to control the spiraling chaos. His demand: federal intervention, even the deployment of the National Guard. But Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson pushed back fiercely, rejecting what they called unconstitutional overreach. At the same time, Trump defended a broader immigration operation targeting criminal illegal aliens, framing it as part of the solution. Caught between a tragedy on the streets and a political clash at the highest levels, Chicago found itself at the crossroads of violence, power, and national debate, raising a haunting question: is this truly about safety or about control? By twilight, the loop felt like a drum stretched too tight. Downtown Chicago's lights shimmered against the cold pavement, washing the streets in a restless glow. People moved in small clusters, the weekend energy buzzing like electricity in the air. Yet beneath the chatter and footsteps, there was a heaviness, a quiet sense that the night was holding its breath. And then the silence snapped. Gunfire cracked through the heart of the city. A crowd of teenagers scattered in all directions, screams echoing between the buildings as bodies dropped to the ground. 8 young people, all between 13 and 17, were struck. Within the hour, a second burst of gunfire tore through another nearby group. In the chaos, one of the victims, a 14-year-old, would not survive. It wasn't only the violence that unsettled Chicago. It was where it happened. This wasn't the shadowed outskirts or a forgotten block. This was the loop. Tourists, shoppers, office workers, families, all swept into a moment of terror they never saw coming. As paramedics rushed to the wounded and officers secured the streets with fast, clipped urgency, the city fell under a new kind of tension. Headlines would soon arrive. Rumors would spread even faster. And while Chicago reeled from the raw shock of what had happened, someone hundreds of miles away was already preparing to respond. Donald Trump did not wait for dawn. His statement crashed onto social media like a hammer. Chicago was out of control. Leadership had failed. The city's mayor and Illinois' governor were, he said, refusing help they desperately needed. He claimed people were chanting for his intervention, demanding federal force to restore order. For Trump, this wasn't just a tragedy, it was confirmation of everything he'd been warning about. And the solution, he insisted, was clear: federal action. Even the National Guard. He pointed to Washington, D.C., where he had previously declared a crime emergency and deployed the Guard. Chicago, he argued, could be next. The violence of the night became his justification, the spark for a broader plan, one that blended crime policy with political pressure. But in Chicago, resistance came quickly and fiercely. Mayor Brandon Johnson pushed back with sharp, unwavering resolve. He announced that Chicago would cooperate with federal agents only on the city's terms, and that his officers would not operate in secrecy or under concealed identities. He warned of federal overreach and the dangers of militarizing a major American city. Governor J.B. Pritzker echoed that stance, calling Trump's threats un-American, and warning that deploying federal troops without state consent would set off a constitutional battle. Civil liberties groups sounded alarms as well, drawing parallels to some of the most tense moments in modern American history. At the same time, Trump was intensifying a separate campaign, a federal operation targeting individuals he labeled criminal illegal aliens, with Chicago as one of its primary battlegrounds. In his narrative, crime and immigration were woven tightly together. A single, sweeping issue, he argued, could only be solved through aggressive federal intervention. The city found itself caught between a tragedy unfolding in its streets and a political storm gathering overhead. Violence had ignited the moment, but what came next would be shaped not only by bullets, but by power, pressure, and the clashing visions of those who claimed to know how to fix Chicago. And this was only the beginning. Thank you for listening and for supporting this growing channel. Your time, your presence, and your voice help bring these important stories to life. Let's continue building this community together. By the next morning, the city was still reeling, the echoes of gunshots in the loop night before tracing into every headline, every debate, every breath. The streets where teenagers gathered lay quiet now, cordoned off, visited by investigators and emergency vehicles. But far above, in corridors of power, the argument had already started anew. Donald Trump seized the moment. He portrayed the chaos as proof. Chicago needed a massive federal intervention. He flung out the idea of sending in the National Guard, not just as backup, but as a force to reshape the very nature of enforcement in the city. To him, this was more than crime, it was a test of his vision. A city spiraling into disorder, calling out for an external savior. He backed his call with a broader plan, Operation Midway Blitz, a sweeping escalated crackdown targeting criminal illegal aliens in Illinois, especially in Chicago. In this framing, crime and immigration were not separate challenges but two sides of the same crisis. The solution was unified, removing those he deemed dangerous, reinforcing America's laws and reasserting federal authority. But as his rhetoric grew sharper, the response from Chicago's leadership was resolute. Mayor Brandon Johnson didn't mince words. He rejected the idea of militarization of his city. He warned that deploying troops could inflame tensions, worsening the very issues that Trump claimed to address. He signed an executive order that drew a firm line. Chicago's police would not operate under hidden identities to aid federal agents. He told Trump in effect, "Not here. Not like that." Governor J.B. Pritzker added his own warning. Using the guard without state consent would spark a constitutional showdown. He argued that sending troops was not just unnecessary, it was legally thin and politically dangerous. To him, this was not just about public safety but about preserving civil liberties. In the background, crime statistics added fuel to the argument. According to city figures, violent crime had actually dropped significantly in 2025, shootings and homicides, down over 30% from the same time the year before. Total violent crime was also down in double-digit percentages. These weren't minor fluctuations. They were meaningful, structural trends in a city that had seen enough violence to know what danger looked like. Some officials suggested that Chicago's own investments, in community violence prevention, housing, education, mental health, were already making a difference. In their eyes, Trump's proposed solution of brute force was tone-deaf, missing the deeper roots of trouble. On one side stood a president offering a forceful, dramatic fix. On the other, local leaders pointing to long-term, human-centered work. Chicago's own advocates argued that investing in people would do more than sending in soldiers. They saw Trump's proposal not simply as a policy option, but as a political gambit that risked deepening trauma. In public comments, violence prevention experts warned that aggressive law enforcement tactics would only fuel distrust in communities already haunted by over-policing. They urged investment in healing and restorative programs instead of tanks and uniforms. To them, enforcing justice wasn't about showing power, it was about restoring dignity. Meanwhile, the battleground of public opinion widened. Trump's base, he said, was responding. He claimed Chicagoans were chanting for his arrival, a demand for a tough hand. But many residents rejected this narrative, insisting they needed more than soldiers. They needed understanding, infrastructure, a genuine investment in the neighborhoods that bore the burden of violence. Behind the political posturing, the city's fabric strained. Community leaders said Trump's approach could unravel trust. They worried that fear, not safety, would grow if the guard marched in. And they reminded everyone that Chicago's true strength came not from force, but from its people, residents who had lived through hardship, grief, and change. The tension was real and raw. The debate wasn't just about crime statistics. It was about identity, about governance, about how a city rebuilds when its people are hurting. Trump saw a crisis to be confronted with strength. Chicago's leaders saw a chance to heal with purpose. As the dust settled on the weekend's violence, a new kind of struggle had begun. One fought not with guns on the streets but with ideas, with law, and with the hearts of the city. Morning broke over Chicago with a kind of heavy, metallic gray sky that always seemed to mirror the city's tension. News vans lined the streets. Microphones crowded into the faces of shaken witnesses. And as investigators combed the downtown scene for shell casings and camera angles, the political earthquake was already moving faster than the police tape could be secured. Inside City Hall, the mood was brittle. Mayor Brandon Johnson, who had spent months navigating a delicate balance between reform-minded policing and community-centered solutions, now faced a surge of criticism from all directions. Overnight, national headlines had turned Chicago's latest tragedy into a political flashpoint, and Trump's renewed call for a federal crackdown reverberated through the local leadership like a warning shot. During a tense press conference, the mayor condemned the shooting with evident frustration. He acknowledged the fear gripping residents, the fatigue of families tired of explaining violence to their children, and the frustration of officers working under intense public scrutiny. But he made it clear, Chicago would not be militarized under an election season talking point. Still, even he knew the pressure was mounting. City council members fielded calls from constituents who wanted stronger patrols. Others demanded deeper investments in mental health and youth programs. Activists warned against fear-based governance. Business leaders pleaded for stability as tourism and retail spending trembled under the weight of national attention. Everyone agreed the violence had to stop. No one agreed on how. Meanwhile, detectives pieced together the night's events. A confrontation turned chaotic. A gun pulled too quickly. A crowd scattering as the sound of shots cracked against city steel and pavement. A life lost in seconds, and a city left to relive its deepest anxieties. As investigators traced the weapon and pulled surveillance footage frame by frame, another storm brewed online. Clips of the crime scene flooded social media. Commentators dissected Chicago's policies. Supporters of Trump amplified his message. Critics accused him of exploiting tragedy. In less than 24 hours, a local crime had become a national battleground. Behind closed doors, city officials prepared for a long week: briefings, strategy sessions, neighborhood meetings, political defense. The mayor insisted Chicago was not failing. It was struggling, yes, but fighting toward solutions that didn't rely on force alone. Still, even his allies sensed the shifting ground. With the presidential election in motion and Trump's voice echoing across the country, every move Chicago made would now be watched, weaponized, or praised, depending on who was looking. And as the city braced itself, one fact loomed above all else. The tragedy downtown was no longer just a crime story. It was a test of leadership, of policy, and of how much political flames could rise from a single spark in the heart of a wounded city. As Chicago worked to steady itself, the shockwaves from the downtown shooting rippled far beyond Illinois. What had begun as a tragic burst of violence on a crowded city street was now fueling a national confrontation over crime, leadership, and the future of public safety in America. Cable news networks looped the footage on repeat, each with its own spin. Commentary panels sharpened the story into opposing narratives. One insisting cities were unraveling under soft-on-crime policies, the other arguing that fear was being weaponized for political gain. And at the center of that debate, whether welcomed or not, stood Chicago. In Washington, lawmakers seized the moment. Supporters of a federal intervention argued that repeated violence in major cities proved local officials had lost control. They pointed to the shooting as the latest symbol of systemic breakdown, calling for aggressive federal oversight and sweeping national strategies. Opponents countered that such moves would undermine local autonomy, escalate tensions, and ignore root causes like poverty and illegal gun trafficking. It was a policy tug-of-war that had played out many times before, but this time the stakes were amplified by a looming election and a former president eager to reassert his law and order brand. Behind the scenes, federal agencies quietly assessed whether the incident warranted operational involvement. There was no official confirmation, but murmurs circulated about enhanced intelligence sharing, emergency funding proposals, and potential joint task force expansions. Even the possibility of federal action was enough to raise eyebrows in city leadership circles. Meanwhile, Chicago's police department continued its painstaking work. Detectives traced the events leading to the fatal confrontation, interviewing witnesses still rattled by the echo of gunfire. Surveillance teams followed digital trails, vehicles caught on distant cameras, social media posts that hinted at rising tensions, and prior incidents involving the individuals present at the scene. Every detail mattered. Every minute was valuable. But the investigation unfolded under an unusually bright national spotlight. Every update, even small ones, sparked waves of commentary. Every silence fueled speculation. The people of Chicago found themselves caught in a strange duality, grieving a very real loss while watching the tragedy become a pawn in conversations far bigger than their neighborhoods. At vigils across the city, residents gathered with candles, prayers, and weary expressions. They spoke of a community tired of mourning strangers, tired of explaining to children why sirens were so common, tired of politicians using their pain as proof points instead of listening. Yet there was also a defiant kind of hope. Community leaders organized late-night safety walks. Youth groups held emergency meetings to keep kids engaged and indoors. Churches opened their doors for counseling and quiet reflection. Amid chaos and politics, Chicago's own people refused to surrender their city's narrative to outsiders. Still, the question remained, and it grew larger with each passing day. Would this tragedy lead to meaningful change, or simply become another spark consumed by the fire of national rhetoric? As the country argued, and the investigation neared a critical turn, the story of the shooting was no longer just about what happened, but about what America would choose to do with it. By the time investigators pieced together their final timeline, the nation was already holding its breath. Chicago's downtown shooting had shifted from a single devastating moment into a symbol, of urgency, of division, and of a country searching for answers in all the noise. Detectives revealed the path that led to that fatal clash. A simmering conflict between two individuals, a sudden escalation, and a stolen gun that never should have been in circulation. Every detail confirmed what Chicagoans had long understood: violence rarely erupts out of nowhere. It grows in the cracks, in the neglect, in the shadows where systems fail and desperation festers. The final report struck a balance that few expected. The shooting was not random, not gang-orchestrated, not politically motivated. It was the tragic intersection of personal conflict and easy access to illegal firearms, a combination Chicago knew too well. Public reaction was immediate. Some argued the findings underscored the need for tougher law and order measures. Others insisted it proved that deeper prevention efforts, mental health interventions, and community support were the only way forward. The debate intensified, louder than ever, fueled by pundits, politicians, and commentators eager to claim the narrative. But beneath the shouting, the city's grief remained painfully quiet. A family mourned their loved one, a life cut short not by ideology, but by a moment of irreversible choice. They remembered the victim as more than a headline. Someone who loved music, who worked hard, who made people laugh, who left behind a ripple of emptiness that statistics could never measure. Vigils continued, candles flickering in the winter wind, illuminating faces that carried both sorrow and exhaustion. City officials, pressured from every direction, unveiled a coordinated plan, expanded violence intervention programs, tightened cooperation with federal agencies, and increased patrol presence in high-risk areas. The approach blended prevention and enforcement, an attempt to break the cycle without punishing the city for its pain. Meanwhile, political voices on the national stage kept the story alive. President Trump doubled down on calls for a crackdown. Critics fired back, warning against federal overreach. Supporters praised the urgency. Opponents questioned the motives. Yet Chicago, the city at the center of it all, simply kept moving, carrying the weight of another tragedy while hoping that this time something might actually change. In the end, the shooting did more than spark debate. It forced the nation to look directly into the mirror, to confront what happens when personal conflict meets systemic failure, when politics overshadows prevention, when tragedy becomes a talking point instead of a turning point. But Chicago's people, resilient, weathered, unbroken, refused to let this story end in despair. Their hope, fragile but undeniable, pressed forward through the uncertainty. And as the final words of the investigation settled, one truth lingered in the cold November air. In a city that has endured more than most, the silence after the gunfire is not emptiness. It is a plea for something better, waiting to be answered. Thank you for listening so deeply and walking through this story with us. Your attention, your care, and your willingness to stay with these moments mean more than words can say. By subscribing, sharing, and being part of this community, you help us shine a light on stories that matter, and together we honor the voices, the victims, and the truth. Your support keeps this work alive. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for believing in something better.